very interesting that you're saying that like Europe might be, or Germany might be dragged into something, into a China position that it doesn't want. Like when you like think about this, like, how would you evaluate the next steps? Is it actually possible to be independent, right? To be like, the third big player on the stage that doesn't have to lean to one side or another? Doesn't right now, as it looks, it's very much leaning more and more towards the US side. As you pointed out, this might even intensify. So what kind of discussions are happening right now to, that might want to prevent that?
Well, I think the biggest change is the self-perception. When I started looking into what the European Union is and does, there was a very strong self-confidence that Europe or the European Union is a global power. When we now look at the numbers, this rather looks like a retirement home that shrinks to something like 7% of the global population. We are still representing 500 million people, but these people are rapidly aging and the number of Europeans is shrinking. As I said before, migration might fix the one or the other problem, but there are also problems that come with migration that doesn't necessarily strengthen the ability of the European Union to face the challenges of the 21st century, but it's rather an additional problem that needs to be addressed in necessary infrastructure for integration or signing international agreements to send people back who illegally arrive in the European Union, applying for asylum but don't meet the criteria. There are supply chain problems with a number of products or raw materials that the European Union doesn't have. So the general perception is there's a reason to be more modest, and we become much more condition takers and we can be moderators in international conflicts, but we don't play an active role. First and foremost, because we didn't prepare for this. The European Union has always been much more an economic and a civic power than like soft power compared with a provider of hard power. European citizens don't show a strong appetite to be a military force, which is fine because you can use the money to develop sophisticated welfare systems. But to what extent this is sustainable in the changing demography and in the changing conditions of climate change, that remains to be seen. So it needs a lot of changes and reforms, not only technically on the ground, but also in understanding what the major challenges are within the European Union.
Yeah, it's just like very interesting because nowadays, like looking at the media coverage about China, it's really just about, I would say like 95% is quite negative. At the same time, you might want to still balance it. So, what's behind de-risking is probably not just like, getting rid of China exposure or opposing China. So that cannot be the strategy, right? So, okay. Then one more thing that is, I think, on a lot of people's mind, what we have seen looking at Germany a little bit domestically, is the fact that there seems to have been, in the current government, policies that were recommended or, to a certain extent implemented that, at least I think it's fair to say that, are not very popular. At the same time, you have the more right-wing party, I would say, which is the AfD, kind of now gaining 20%, I think, in Western German states, and in Eastern Germany is now polling around 30%. So that's quite significant. It's a significant change, at least. Like, how do you kind of, what do you make out of it? Like when people, I guess, look at it from the outside, people see something like, a Trump phenomenon playing out, where you have like a lot of voters that like might be really kind of, against, certain positions, might be against, like probably like migration policies, against like certain energy policies. But at the same time, I think what happened in the US, people probably like just didn't listen to many of these people that actually did this protest vote or whatever you want to call it, right? So how do you see this change? Because clearly something is changing. So like, how can we make sense of it?
Well, in the Merkel years, there was a famous saying, like a variation of Maggie Thatcher's Tina, there is no alternative, that Merkel called certain positions that they are without alternative, which is intellectually lame because you can always think something else than what you do. And it only stops the discussion. It ends everything because there's no alternative and you don't explain. And in times of a growing hunger for participation and a public discourse and engaged citizens because of social media and other forms of active participation in a democracy, you cannot just announce that I know better and I don't tell you this. So by this kind of a communication style, not explaining things properly and not getting people on board, you give birth to an alternative that comes as ugly as it appears, being xenophobic, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, dreaming of a different political system, as some of the hardcore supporters of the AfD want Germany to become. But there's also a strong group of people who just feel lost. They see too much change and they don't feel represented. And that's the main difference when we compare it with the United States or with Poland or even with Turkey, that Germany is not in the same way polarized, because there is no alternative is only problematic if 80% of the parties represented in the German parliament are a variation of the same. And it allows a lot of different coalition scenarios, like who could flirt with whom and form what kind of coalition, because at the end of the day, they all want the same thing. They are strongly transatlantic and want to be partner with the United States. They are committed to European integration. They are pro-market economy. They are social to a certain extent. They all totally understand that climate change is the most pressing problem. So if this is the same and there is no variation aside from minor details, people who don't buy this don't feel a home. And there's always been something like a certain percentage in each and every OECD country that is flirting with authoritarian alternatives, and they can be mobilized if the government doesn't deliver. And the current perception of the German government is that it does deliver, but it's expensive and it's complicated and it's not efficient, and they make a lot of technical mistakes in how they write laws and how they communicate them. So there's a lot of confusion and people feel dissatisfied with how the government appears. And the AfD doesn't even need to do anything. They just sit and watch and grow in support because of the poor performance or the perception of the poor performance of a government that is actively addressing reforms, what previous governments haven't done. So they also didn't make a mistake, but they simply postponed the necessity of making investments and addressing reforms on a large scale, which appeared as unpopular, so they didn't do it. So on the one hand, I'm glad that the government is addressing all these reforms. I'm less happy about the changing world that puts so much additional pressure on the plate of what the government is already doing. But I totally understand that this creates confusion and it helps right-wing parties or protest movements to find support. But I hope that the German institutional setting is sufficiently robust to deal with it.
Yeah, I think that's not like, if the institutional setting is robust, it's probably not the concern or like the the mainstream opinion. But what would you say, like, could the AfD become like, what in German you might call like a Volkspartei, like a more moderate or appealing to a broader public? Do you think that could be a scenario, or will it just never really play out, and this is more like a temporary phenomena?
When I was referring to the stability of democratic institutions in Germany, because we have seen the disappearance of the party system as it existed in the past in Italy, in France. We saw Brexit as a major political revolution that ruined the reputation of the Westminster democracy in public perception. So there are fundamental changes in what we consider a Western-type democracy to be, including what's happening in the United States. So in comparison, Germany stands as a solid rock in which quality media and a widespread system of civic institutions and NGOs and the civil society is active and engaged and critical and whatever you need to make a living Western-type democracy work. But as you rightly say, there is a rise of authoritarian thinking and a different, more defensive strategy when it comes to migration policy, when it comes to how we trust in Western-type democratic institutions. And that is serious, but to what extent they would be willing and able, now willing, this is something that they are always dreaming of. They rather see themselves as center and mainstream and a people's party. But I don't think that they could possibly mobilize more than 20% who share the ideals. They can mobilize protest voters, but when you really look at the hardcore enemies of the Western-type democracy Germany is, then I don't think it's much more than 10% of those who flirt with the AfD or openly support it. So this is much more a mishmash of different forms of frustration, losing social status, being upset with a single issue like energy policy or a lack of investment in infrastructure, or the general frustration in the eastern part of Germany that also population-wise was shrinking a lot. We had something like 16 million East Germans at the fall of the Berlin Wall, and now we are down to 10 or so. So it is important as a part of Germany, but the population is 10 compared with 72 or 74 million. So this also needs to be put into perspective, which doesn't make it less difficult when you look at the situation in Saxony, for example, but it is still a special problem compared with what is Germany as a whole and what are the discussions about the AfD in different parts of Germany.
So you don't see any scenario where like a CDU or the opposition party could kind of like, align, their strategy slightly and therefore partner up with the AfD?
Well, we have a very heated discussion at the moment because we have this instrument of summer interviews with leading politicians who step back and look at the bigger picture. And this bigger picture interview of the head of the Conservative Party, that was also not entirely clear whether they want to call themselves a conservative party or what exactly is the new self-definition after 16 years of Merkel, who would certainly not call the Christian Democratic Union a conservative party and rather moved it to the center, knowing that you win elections in the center of the German population and you don't win much if you move to the more right edge of the political spectrum. So this is something like a reinvention of the CDU. And as part of that reinvention by its current leader, Friedrich Merz, he thought of the possibility to end the strict distinction between we don't form any form of alliance with the AfD no matter what, into, well, we can discuss what's happening on a municipality level. Like the local level is okay, but we would never form a coalition on a federal level. And this caused a shitstorm, not only across the board in the German public, but also within his party. And he was openly criticized that someone who says things like that doesn't qualify to be the next chancellor of the Federal Republic, although the polls would show that enough appetite for reform and the German people would rather want another CDU chancellor if elections will be tomorrow or next year. So that's still an open question in what direction we are moving. But I don't see the AfD being qualified to formulate answers to the questions of the 21st century. They can address people's fears, as all populist parties in Europe addresses people's fears, no matter if the fear is based on numbers. Like when we talk of migration policy in Italy, 60,000 migrants arrived in a country of 60 million people. Is this a migration wave? Of course, it's not. But Salvini makes it look like this is the end of the Italian culture, and people fear that this is happening. So this is how populist parties operate. They address the fears and the sentiments of people, and the AfD is doing the same and benefiting from technical and communication problems of the current government. But in order to be a reliable partner of whatever form of coalition, first and foremost, the other conservative party, CDU, requires solutions and a strategy and an agenda. And I don't see any of this coming from the Alternative für Deutschland. For the time being, it's just different from what mainstream parties represent, but it's far from having an answer.
May I ask, like, what would change your mind on this? What would you need to see to say, oh, maybe they are becoming mainstream?
Well, the biggest game changer would be if the Alternative für Deutschland could still be the poor provider of solutions in Germany, but we are surrounded by other countries in which the parties learned their lesson and operate much more effective in turning Europe into something else. We have European parliamentary elections next year, and we have Kaczynski and Orban and Le Pen and Wilders and Meloni and Salvini and Vox in Spain, and a number of parties that perform much more in terms of we have a strategy, we have a plan, we know how to address things. And even if it surfs on a wave of hysteria that doesn't really have a solid empirical base, it brings them into power. So if the European Union will be run by a majority of right-wingers and the Alternative für Deutschland is still not able to deliver solutions for what Germans think is the agenda that needs to be addressed, we operate in a different European Union. And that could be a short-term nightmare that is far more realistic than seeing the Alternative für Deutschland becoming a proper alternative to what well-established parties are able to provide as their agenda that could be challenged by an alternative agenda.
Interesting. Ulrich, before we wrap this up, where can people follow you apart from Cassandra?
I actually try to fly under the radar and don't want to spend too much time on Twitter or what it will be called in the nearer future. So people find me by email or can see me on various media where I appear quite frequently for someone in my position. But that's basically it.
Thank you so much for taking the time, Ulrich. Absolute pleasure.
Thanks for having me.